Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session, the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today, we've looked forward to this for a long time. We've talked about free will since the beginning of the course, but we've never had it as the subject for a lecture until today. So this is something very exciting. It's, if you think about it, a very, very important subject. All the decisions you make during the day, are you just faking it? Was it already predetermined to happen? Or are you actually making decisions? So, Dr. Waugh is going to take you through free will and medicine.
So, good afternoon to you. I hope you're all well on this delightfully warm, sunny afternoon in Edmonton. So I want to talk to you today about free will and medicine because I have found in my career that it is a question that is almost always raised within the context of a medical issue. Right from the earliest time I can remember, whenever there was a medical issue, in my family, there was always the question, well, how could this be? That is, if within the environment as depicted by this video, we are entirely free and God is entirely free to control the world, then how is it that some things happen? I don't think there's anybody in this room that wasn't totally and completely revulsed by the videos of that young airman who was burned alive by ISIS. So the shock and horror of such an absolutely inhuman act of one human against another brings to religious people a real problem. And how, for example, could a benevolent deity of whatever faith tolerate that kind of act? So religious people have struggled with this issue. But in fact, those who are in medicine have also had to struggle with it. It is not just the fact that medicine has a confrontation with people or has to confront things like cancer and other diabolical things that kill people. It's also the fact that a doctor has to sit down beside somebody who he has to tell, you know, from everything I can see, you're going to die. And you have only so much time to live. So physicians find this very, very difficult, obviously. And many occasions, it's precisely this issue that is raised before people give consent for an important surgical operation. Now, years ago, I was in Cairo, and I was working on issues related to medicine and health in Cairo. And I asked a surgeon, he was a heart surgeon, I asked this Muslim heart surgeon, you know, how his career had changed over the years. And he said, you know what? The business itself hasn't changed very much. You know, the anatomy we know and the diseases we know and how to operate we know. But he said the cultural environment in which we work has changed. And the cultural environment in which I work has changed dramatically, he said, when it comes to Muslim sensitivity to whether or not surgery should be carried out. And I said, how so? He said, well, for example, A man came in my office the other day who I now know has a significant brain tumor. And I had to say to him, you know, I'm going to operate on this, but I have to get your permission to do that. And so I gave him the statistics of how, you know, what would happen and how many possibilities he had of surviving. And the man said to me, but I'm not going to let you touch me. He said, if in fact this is a brain tumor, and your pictures seem to show that to me, then it's God's will. And I will live with this until it takes my life. So I don't think there's any reason why I should have an operation, because having the operation to me is, in a way, a violation of what God wants for me. So the amount of time that the operation might buy for me is not worth me trying to violate my belief in what God wants for me. So in surgery, there are all kinds of possibilities, and one of the issues that has, in a study that I'm working on in Muslim sensitivities around medicine, one of the areas is heart transplant. And in heart transplant, the issue is very, very stark there. Because the issue is, am I trumping God's will by having a heart transplant? So in effect then, Muslims are not the only ones that have wrestled with this argument, because this argument has been part and parcel of Western religious tradition going back for centuries. And in fact, then, how you face the whole problem of free will in medicine is a critical part of the way in which medicine is unfolding culturally in society. So it's an important issue that we have to deal with. Let me take you on a little stroll through the park of free will, shall we? And we'll just very briefly encounter some of the things that are going on in this area. So I deliberately put these on each side of this slide so you can see some of the alternatives philosophically and theologically and what we would call ideationally in Western culture. So as you can see here, there's a determinist school attitude towards this issue. On the other side, there is an alternative notion of how it is that free will can be played out. Now, in the determinist school, you can see some of the characteristics of the determinist school. Now, here's a question for you. Have you ever played basketball and thought for sure that you were going to hit the net and miss it by a mile? Were you destined to miss it? Were you ever deeply in love with someone and made overtures to someone only to be met with a brick wall? So is that free will? The determinists say the reaction in this situation is determined. The determinist school says you missed the net, you missed the what do they call that? The basketball net. You missed it because it was determined there were things in the way you were holding the ball, or on and on and on. That's why you missed it. So the determinist school says that you respond because of all the laws of nature and you can't get away from that. Or they also argue that there's really only one possible outcome in any given set of circumstances, that all of that is predetermined. Well, let's skip to the other side now and see what some of the other orientations are for this issue. So, one of them is experiencing the notion of free will is exactly that. It is a human experience. It is not part of the way that the system works. It is, in fact, a kind of epiphenomenon that is attached to every decision that you make, so that you make a decision and you think you are entirely free at making that decision, but in fact it is not that at all. It is just a kind of setup of the way your brain works. So choice is then an activity of the brain, and it is really a fulcrum of your decision making, that whatever choice you make is really predetermined. And by looking at it in a certain perception, with a certain way, you conclude that you did this from your own free will. Nature might be causally determined, but the mind doesn't operate that way. So in effect then, from this perspective, from the alternative perspective, we can see many, many different ways in which you can explain what's happening in free will. So let's suppose you have no free will to make a decision about having this brain operation. Some of the problems in not allowing humans to have free will is I think, pretty dangerous. For example, the loss of effective motivation. If you're going to flunk university, what's the sense of you taking this course? If you're going to end up dying of some kind of disease, what's the sense of, waiting around for that end point? Why don't we just introduce the whole issue about death right away and euthanasia? Another dimension of this problem has to do with the escalation of what we would call mental problems. So people who have no particular motivation appear to lose all dimensions of concern, all dimensions of activity, all volitional concerns for what's going to happen in their lives. So, in effect, the death that comes is really a kind of social engineering thing. Now, if we accepted this proposition, if we accepted that there was no free will, you can see some of the problems that we would have. One of them, majorly, would be how we could motivate people to do anything. So here's some of the downside then from the alternatives perspective. So there are some facts that are incontrovertible when it comes to determinism. That is, if I take this book and I drop it, I know that it's going to drop. There's just no two ways about it. It's going to drop. That seems to be exactly what the determinist school is saying. And if you argue then that it can't be determined, then you're going to have to explain the fact that that book always falls every time I let go of it. It's also the case that even the aging processes can't be challenged. That is, there's no sense of you taking your vitamins because it's not going to help you live any longer. So you have, 70 years and 10, and that's it. Those of you who know Scotch Bobby Burns know that he said the best laid plans of mice and men gang up the gley. So in effect, the group that's trying to argue for the alternative says, well, you know, no matter how much you plan for these things, no matter how much you are convinced that you're going to do these things, there's always things that don't work out. So there's a number of issues that we can examine in this way. So what I want to propose to you is that free will presents us with a modeling problem. That is, that there are various models that you can bring to try to address the issue of free will, and these models themselves contribute to the outcome of what you get. So there is no one distinctive viewpoint on free will from what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that it's a modeling issue, how you model the whole problem of free will and medicine that is going to determine what comes out of it. So, for example, look at what Buddhism says. Buddhism argues that there is no essential connection between the way your mind works and the way the world is. That is, science and all of our constructions are merely that. They are human constructions. So understanding the way the world works is a matter of happenstance. The relationship between the mind and what happens, there is no identifiable connection. So that means then that the mind itself runs as a kind of wild horse. It goes wherever it wants to go. It has its own interpretation of things. And so whatever you lay upon the mind is only what you lay upon the mind. There is no essential connection between the causality of the world and the causality that's inherent in the way you make these decisions. Well then, suppose you look at Western religions, and we've talked about some of those, so I won't spend much more time on it, but Western religions is solely committed to the notion of an all-powerful deity, and that deity determines exactly what it is that's going to happen. And these things are critical. So, the human mind then is somehow or other directly connected to the order and the will of God. The most famous statements of Christianity probably are those associated with Jesus when he said, "Not my will, but thy will be done." And those kinds of statements from Christianity have indicated then that there is an overall will associated with God and that individuals must submit to it. The other attitude to take, and the one that you find most in scientific journals and especially neurological journals, is that in fact the brain itself and its circuitry is the root and shape of what we would call the free will experience. And for most, it's related to the whole issue of memory. That is, what do you remember and how you remember it. So, the rainbow technique labels these brain cells in more than 100 different hues with 100 different colors. So, neuroscientists can trace the connections between them. So, in effect, the brain consists of billions of cells, and each of these cells contacts thousands of others. So, the brain itself is such a complex machine that trying to apply a causality system to it shows how impossible our science is at the moment. So now I want to take you to Calgary, to Walter Glannon, who argues, in fact, that what we need is a complete reframing of the whole problem of free will. So, from his perspective then, free will is purely a construct of the brain, and it's not connected to the external world at all. So while you think that if you pick this ball up and throw it towards the hoop, it will go in there, as far as Walter's perspective on this is, it is only happenstance that it goes in the right direction. The generation of the experience is best studied by then neurological science, and neurological and psychiatric disorders is a way into understanding how the free will works. And so he suggests then that we look at things like obsessive compulsive disorders, that we look at things like Parkinson's, that we look at brain traumas, that we examine people in depression. And if we do that, you will see those that reflect loss of free will. And by isolating those areas of the brain that indicate where free will can be located, we can find the construct to re-identify the notion of free will as part of the causal construction of the brain. And he argues this way because, you see, he thinks that technology in the future will develop a brain implant. And these brain implants then can replace those parts of the brain that are defective. The brain implants can be, very small, and they can be attached to your head, and they can then be connected. And this connection then will provide a way of remodeling how the brain works. From his perspective then, he argues that we can do deep brain stimulation. We can use deep brain stimulation as a way to restore whatever system there is in the brain that produces this sense of free will. Now, there's some very interesting information on the web about this area of study, and I hope we can have a little discussion about it. But from his perspective, the fact that we can stimulate the brain in this deep fashion is a significant way of opening up the whole question of free will. From Walter's perspective, free will is measurable. That is, once we know the problems within the brain, we can then measure how much stimulation will be needed in order to get people to have the sense of free will again. So how many of you have friends or relatives who have been depressed? Well, then you know that depression is one of those things that absolutely flattens all attempts to do anything. That people who are depressed are not motivated, they are not interested, they are totally turned off, and from the perspective of their brain, it's just not functioning as a sensing free will agent at all. So Walter argues in his books and in his papers that if we could find out those systems and we could replace those systems, or we could stimulate them, what we could do then is bring back the experience of free will. That is the notion that I can change myself or I can change the world. His perspective then is that the neurological development of the brain is the way forward in the future. And what he is not concerned about is to try to explain away free will, but to try to reconstruct free will so that people will have this kind of motivation to do something important for themselves. Well, like everything else, there's a downside. And the downside to this deep stimulation is the fact that we don't know, A, whether the brain is uniformly responsive to the same amount of stimulation for all people. We don't know that. Nor do we know whether deep brain stimulation will work the same way for everybody. So in effect, then, we might have a different kind of outcome depending upon the individual's brain makeup. While stimulation processes can be beneficial, there's also an issue. They could overstimulate, and then we would have what we would call the collapse of the brain, and we would have huge negative outcomes. So, this is all experimental at this point in time, and it's based upon a number of assumptions. So, deep brain stimulation has some major issues. For those of you who are interested in ethical issues, I've placed two here. Who, in effect, is acting? If your brain is being stimulated, if it is being increased, and if your so-called free will is being expressed vigorously, well, who is acting? Are you acting, or is it the machine? So is this ethical issue of stimulating the brain a third intervener in the whole problem? So, finally, who's responsible? Is the doctor? Is the guy that throws the switch? Is it the chap that puts the implant in the brain? Or are you, that are, when you're receiving this, are you responsible for the results? Well, these are ethical issues that we haven't really got around to dealing with yet. So, I want to move on now to Mele. You have some material that I passed around that he has been working on. Mele is a scientist and a philosopher. Actually, he's a philosopher in Miami, and he has I think, an important view on this whole issue. The notion that free will is a human experience has been debunked as far back as Nietzsche. So Nietzsche himself said the inner world is full of phantoms, right? The will is one of them. So will no longer moves anything, hence it does not explain anything either, and is merely accompanies events. It is also absent. So whatever you experience from Nietzsche's point of view is totally a phenomenon. It has no reality in making you do anything at all. If we go on with Mele, he argues that neuroscience, the neural activity, may be unrelated to intentionality, in fact. So that neural activity may or only be partly affected by consciousness. You have to be conscious to have a free will. How would you understand free will if you were not awake? And in your dreams, for example, do you experience free will there? Or are these dreams all indicated as being automatic, running, and you have no instance of free will involvement in them at all? So one of the issues that Mele raises is that there are, in fact, different ways of understanding free will itself. And he calls this regular, mid-grade, and premium. So, what is free will that is regular? I need a drink, I pick up the bottle, and I said, I need a drink. This is a kind of regular awareness of what's going on, but there is no, in what I would say, active kind of involvement of my brain in it. I just pick it up automatically and I take a drink out of it. Then I don't even think about it. Malay's idea is when you're going to make a signal and you turn the turn signal on in your car. When you turn the signal on in your car, it's almost automatic. You don't think about it. Well, there are many of those things that we don't think about. For example, when you take a step, do you think about that step and where you're going to put it? Not likely unless you're walking on ice. So in effect, a whole range of activities that we do are regular. Then there's what he would call mid-grade. Mid-grade are those where we deliberately make the decision to do something. I.e., I am going to go to the bank and I'm going to get $100 out and I'm going to go out for dinner tonight. That's what I'm going to do. So this mid-grade then is a plan of action that is deliberately set in motion. It's unlike the regular because the regular is largely unconscious. Mid-grade is really commitment. And then by the time you get to premium, it's what you're doing here, i.e., this is a long-term commitment to getting an education so that you can formulate a career so that you can get on with your life. So this is a major kind of free will exercise. Well, one of the issues that Melee faces, of course, is that, well, what's the distinction between one of these things and the other? How do you clarify those kinds of distinctions? And you certainly have to know those if you're going to start muddling around with people's brains. So at this point in time, this is merely a kind of shadowing. So here's some of the contentions of those who want to use the brain and its difficulties as the basis for analyzing free will. Neuroscience argues very, very persuasively that the brain's actions are unconscious. That most of the things that make you do what you do have nothing to do with conscious action at all. That they are rooted in the unconscious life of your brain. From a neuroscientific perspective, then, it may seem to be present, but it's really not there. It really has no impact and no outcome. So if you read the materials from Libet, you'll find his argument that you cannot see anything of significance in what the brain does. It is all unconscious, and all of that experience has no impact on whether or not you hit the hoop with the basketball or not. Another issue, no scientific evidence that neural activity is impacted by anything other than electrical charges. So, for example, if you do a sampling of your thinking in a moment when you say this is free will, if you do that sampling, all of that will show you that there's nothing more involved here than an electric charge. There is no external stimulation whatsoever. So, the bottom line for neuroscience is that the free will is really an epiphenomenon that is rendered explainable by other means. So, I want to look at this second video and show you some research by an important researcher in this area. So another individual who regards free will as a phenomenon of the brain is Wegner. And Wagner argues that movement without conscious will, including facilitated communication, utilization behavior, and moving as an automograph. Now, how many of you know what a Ouija board is? My goodness, I didn't think anybody would know what a Ouija board is. Well, a Ouija board is it's a board that has certain directions printed on it. And you rest your hands on the board, and then you consciously say, should I go to class today? And without looking at the board or without consciously telling your hands what to do, your hands automatically go towards yes. Well, sometimes. So the Ouija board is what we would call a popular magical tool to determine what you're really thinking, as opposed to your own indecision about this, okay? So you close your eyes, you put your hands on the Ouija board, and you say, should I marry him? No. So then you say, okay, that's it. You're finished, bud. Goodbye. So in effect, the Ouija board is one of those tools that were used for years and years and years to make decisions. I remember it because my mother and father used to go to friends. Both of them were really old Irish types, these friends, and they used the Ouija board all the time. So my mother and father would go to what we called at home Ouija parties. So, should you buy a new car? They used the Ouija board. Should you go on this trip? Use the Ouija board. Should you have another kid? Use the Ouija board. So, I found it fascinating because halfway through the experience of using the Ouija board, my father one day said, that's it. We're not going back there anymore. So I asked my mother what was going on, and she said, well, my father asked a question, and it gave him an answer, and he didn't like it. So he said, I don't care what the Ouija board says, I don't like this answer. The Ouija board was an attempt, a kind of what we would call folk attempt, to tap into the unconscious, arguing that the unconscious has more to do with the decision-making than we know. Well, this is the same kind of idea that's going on in these neuroscientific studies. These arguments are that, when we go in and do these kinds of studies, we find that a conscious decision really has already been made, and that's the whole point of Libet's experiment. It's already there, it's already been done. All you have to say is, yes, I'm going to do that. Well, the outcome from all of this should be pretty clear by now. That is, from a neuroscientific perspective, the phenomenon of free will is just that. It is a phenomenon. Well, you wouldn't expect me to get up here and let neuroscientists get away with this, would you? I mean, you know that I'm the leading contra in the whole class. So here's some contras to the neurological framing structure. I'm put up here that it's far more complex than just reading the, whether or not you push the button and whether or not you make the decision before you push the button or not. My argument is that the brain and the brain's life is something that's really so complex that we really have no idea what relationship there is between the notion of free will and the neurological outcomes that we see here. My perspective on this issue is the brain is so complex that we are only at the beginning in comprehending what it is like. Alfred Mealy and his group argue then that there could be subliminal influences on your brain that can't even be rendered according to neurological science. That there could be tendencies going on in the way that your brain works that is completely distinctive to you. And from his perspective, the argument that God can have an impact on will then remains an open question. So the next issue is about intentionality and whether we can make a distinction between weak and strong intentionality. I think you experience that. You know, do you really want wine or beer? That's a big question. But you're not, either one of them is okay, right? So can weak or strong intentionality discount this kind of notion of free will that I have? I was free to sleep in this morning. I could have slept in this morning. I didn't. Why didn't I? The notion of weak and strong intentionality is always trumped by this kind of presupposition on our part that we are absolutely free to make a decision that is contra to everything we have done. So one of the problems that we have then is trying to explain behavior of people who suddenly change directions completely. Being in religious studies, I encountered this in what we would call conversion phenomena. Now, some of you are not old enough to know that we went through the cult era. I think Kim is old enough for that. We went through a cult era in which people gave up everything. They sold the farm. They gave up all of their inheritances. And they became members of cults, some of whom were actually very destructive. Why would people do that? Why would someone who is a really successful banker or a really successful businessman suddenly decide in the middle of that success that he's giving the whole thing up? He's divorcing his wife, he's saying goodbye to his kids, and he's going to live in Guyana with some strange group. Or the ones in Quebec who believed that they were going to, at some point, be transformed from this world to another planet, and so they were burned alive. Why would people's minds, why would their free will operate that way? From my perspective, these extreme cases of the expression of free will indicates that we may never get to the bottom of this notion of free will, that the complexities of the human brain are so much and so great that we may not ever be able to determine that. Religious people argue that that's the area that God operates at. How you can quantify that, however, is completely beyond me. So the last issue from a neurological perspective is, if we have no free will, why don't we just not do anything right now? If we have no free will, why bother? And when I tell you, I'm sorry, you have no free will, you're going to flunk this course, what are you going to say to me? Well, I hope you'll say, like hell, you know, I'm going to do well in this course. So the notion that somebody can come by and say you have no free will, to me, points out the fact that we are not convinced by this kind of thing. So let me end off with a few more discussions about these modeling issues. We really haven't figured out yet the relationship between the mind and the body. I know that this goes back to the Greeks. I know that Western science and Western medical science especially is based upon the Greek distinction between the mind and the body. But the relationship between these two entities is still unclear after all these years. There are scientists who argue that the body does have a direct impact on the brain, and the brain has a direct impact on the body. But the presuppositions about Western science has been that there is a distinction between the mind and the body, and that's precisely why they can apply scientific causality to understanding the science of the body. That is, they discount the impact of the mind in any kind of processes associated with the body. The last point that I could make is that from many perspectives, but certainly from the causality perspective, if all of your mental states can be causally rendered, does that make a difference in your understanding of who you are? I think it does. I think it has some significant impacts on it. My final point is that intelligence itself may have an impact on this concept of free will. I am also convinced that consciousness has an impact on it, but that's another issue we'll have to take for another day. But I argue here that intelligence and how intelligent people are reflects the fact that free will is related to and perhaps is activated upon by intelligence. So the levels of intelligence that we see are indicative of what I would call the power of the brain. And they need not, I think, then indicate that they are all scientifically explained, that is, causally explained, as neuroscientists sometimes argue. So here is my final slide, and here is some of the perspectives that I brought to this study. I find all of these models to have serious flaws. From the very beginning of the God controlling the world, right through to the philosophical issue, right through to the scientific and to the neuroscientific, all of them, from my view, have serious flaws, and we could spend time on all of them if we had time. Understanding what goes on in the world may be only a species of the understanding that problem that we have between mind and body. So the Buddhist argument that the mind is a kind of wild horse and its relationship with the world around it is tenuous at best and probably has no direct connection whatsoever to the world. Until we figure out the relationship between mind and body, I think we will have a problem in figuring out the relationship between humans and robots. And so long as the mind remains a hidden reality, so long as it remains so complex as it is, we have really no way into it, despite the work of Lebert and company. So, have you ever encountered in your dream something that happened to you a long time ago and you wondered where in the world it came from? Why would it come up? Why would this all of a sudden appear? And look at all your experience that you're having right now that you don't even consciously have anything to do with. The breath you're taking, the heartbeats, the tickling in your big toe, the unconscious attitude that you have of moving back and forth or moving forward and back. All of these kind of what we would think are muscle movements that have no particular significance. Why do all of those things pass through your experience without catching on? They have no permanent relationship to your concept of free will at this moment. And yet they may be unconsciously related to this notion of free will. We just do not know. So, guess what? You have a whole area of research ahead of you. And I think that, the tools are there. We can begin looking at this. But from my perspective, free will is still out of the grasp of medicine and out of the grasp of science. Thank you.
So why is the argument about free will in terms of absolutisms? Because we saw arguments saying, oh, we have absolute free will. We can choose to do things and we can choose not to do things, everything. Or there's no free will at all. Everything you're doing is predetermined. So why isn't there a middle ground?
Well, there is a middle ground. I tried to portray the fact that there is a middle ground, and that middle ground, early on in the discussion of free will, it had something to do with alternative models of what free will was. The old understanding of free will was the alternative. That is, there was free will or there was not free will. That's the determinist issue. But that has been largely discounted by most scientists who argue that there's too much evidence that free will operates in much more complex ways than that. So, but the other kinds of options then are to try to understand free will either as the neuroscientist does, or to try to understand free will as an experience that goes along with life decisions, and that therefore it's somehow or other related to these decisions. So there are many options, but there's no conclusive, there's nothing conclusive at this moment. And that's why I say to you that, this generation will have to solve this.
My second question is about the deep brain stimulation. So when someone is under deep brain stimulation, and let's say they commit a crime because some region in their brain has been stimulated and they had to act a certain way, is there a possibility that we can judge the matter the same way we look at cases where people commit crimes when they're intoxicated, people commit crimes when they're high on drugs? Because if we believe that there's an extent, there's a free will, then that person can consciously make a choice to be subjected to deep brain stimulation, and then also be clearly notified of the consequences of the treatment and the extent of how much that could affect his or her decisions. So in that case, we can go into...
Yeah, you raise an interesting question, and it's got legal ramifications, right? Because the courts in Canada and in the West generally have accepted that people operate in a certain way, but under the influence of drugs or under the influence of some serious illness, like a very serious depression or something, that individuals may, in those situations, do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do. The court have recognized that state as a negation of their free will. That is, that in that case, they were not acting as a person. They were acting under the influence of something that changed them. So I would assume that ethically, the issue that you're trying to raise would come up in the same way about deep brain stimulation. So if, for example, you were deep brain stimulated and then you went out and did something horrendous, your defense could be, well, the stimulation itself, worked against what I really want to do and what I really am. And so consequently, I am not responsible for it. The courts accept that kind of argument. The issue is whether you would accept that kind of argument. And there are certain restrictions placed on how much of that the courts will accept. That chap who cut up the student in Montreal, right? I mean, he argued that he was in a deep mental trough and he did it because he was psychologically deranged. The court did not accept that.
So if you do believe in a soul, for instance, would that kind of be similar to our idea of what free will or our consciousness is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, philosophers have argued that if there is any reality to the soul, it is rooted in this notion of the individual's free will. So some people argue then that the whole religious notion about injecting the soul into humans is a species of this, i.e. this personalization of the individual. So the soul is, in effect, the basis of free will.
So I'm not sure if I'm not understanding the determinist perspective, but it's their argument doesn't make any sense to me in that the argument is everything we do is already defined, and the evidence that they have behind it is watch me drop something, it'll fall to the ground. But that's basic science. How can you use basic physics to justify a philosophical perspective? This argument of, if you drop a book, it'll fall to the ground. But if you take a basketball shot, will it make it or not? Right? You can't know that, unless you've made the shot. But then, you mentioned how the determinist perspective is that, if the shot misses, it's because of a variety of reasons of, your hand position was wrong, or, you shot it with too much power, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Right? And if it does make it, then the reason it made it is not because the reason it made it is because you were destined to make it because, you shot it properly with all the same force. But that seems like it's covering all the bases without saying anything concrete, I guess, is what I'm getting at. The argument seems like it's eliminating any, chance for discussion around it of it happened because all the factors were exactly in place. It didn't happen because one factor that I can't define isn't in place. That seems like a not very solid argument.
Okay, so let's try this, okay? The reason why, you've got black hair is because you were predestined to have black hair. So the reason why you're the size you are is that you were predestined to have that size. So from a determinist model, then, all of the principal parts of your being has been predetermined. So your notion that you have some sense of free will in deciding what you will do for the next 50 years of your life is illusory. Because just as sure as you have black hair now, and as sure as you're 5'8" or 9" now, in 50 or 60 or 70 years, you'll be dead. So there is then, from a determinist model, no real significance to your illusion about having free will. No, you couldn't. You can diet, but you can't change it. So the point being then that everything in this world is determined. You see, that's the point, in the world. The argument, the original argument of determinism is, look at the world, see what happens there, and on the basis of that, of what's happening there, make your decision about whether or not you have free will or not. So if you look at the book falling and you look at the fact that you've got black hair and that you look the same as your dad does, all of these things indicate that you are predetermined in what you are.
So choice doesn't exist.
No.
I was predestined.
Yes, that's right. The whole thing is an illusion from a determinist perspective. Now, the theological problem is that after the Greeks developed this idea, the theologians, the Christian theologians, took it over and argued then that God controls the whole shebang. So that, you know, what happens to you is somehow or other hooked in with what God says is going to happen to you. So you have really no options, you know. So you might have an illusion about free will, but from a determinist perspective, it's all, as they say in the Quran, it is written.
I just wanted to take that question back to your original conversation about how it applies to healthcare and medicine. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about, you were talking about certain patients who, at the revelation that they have a terminal illness, say, okay, that's God's will, so I'm refusing treatment. I was just thinking back to our conversation we had a couple weeks ago about ethics, about the responsibility then of the doctor, the nurse to, like, I guess, what is the role of the healthcare provider in that situation? How do you approach a situation where an individual's religious beliefs or their perception of their own free will interferes in their chance at improving their health? What is the role of the doctor, I guess, in terms of advice, or how do you approach that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you that it's a huge problem. For example, we've just had one in Canada not too long ago where a woman took her child out of the hospital and said she was going to take her to an Aboriginal healer in Florida, right? And she was going to do this because she no longer had any confidence in the hospital or in the system of chemotherapy that she was getting. And so that she wanted then the child to have exposure to this alternate remedy. Well, I got an email from my colleague in Montreal who is a neuroscientist, and he said, my God, you know, you're one of these guys that talk about, you know, traditional healing. What do you think about the fact that the doctors have gone to court to argue that the child should be taken away from the parents now and have this chemo? And I said, well, why do you argue so vehemently about that? Because he said, we know that in fact you can, we have about 90% success rate with these kinds of cancers by using these chemotherapy. But what kind of conviction is she going to have that she can get that kind of percentage out of going to this doctor? I said, you've missed the whole point. The whole point is whether or not culture determines who should have the right to this kind of decision. Is it the doctor that decides for you what you will do? Now, that's why we say when you're an adult, you can tell the doctor. In that case, the perception is that there is only one medical system, and that one medical system is the only effective way, and therefore the child should be taken from the mother. Well, the court said no. For the first time in Canadian history, the court said no. That in effect there is no absolute guarantee for the chemotherapy. If you can't guarantee absolutely for the chemotherapy, then you can't argue that she should not go anyplace else. And of course, the child went to Florida and she died.
So when we talked about the Christian perspective, the deterministic perspective, and so from the Christian perspective, we say it is predestined. Like the Christian theologians took the Greeks' view and adopted this view where everything is predetermined. But in terms of a lot of the theology in the New Testament actually tells people they have free will. They can choose between sinning or not sinning, and they can choose between whenever they're faced with temptations, they can choose. At the end of the day, and they have to pray God's will be done instead of their own will, right? And it's the same for similar for Islam, although it says it is written or maktub. It's believers always have a choice to obey God or not, to obey Allah or not. And I feel like a lot of the times, at least most of the major religions get thrown into a box where they're viewed as having this absolute deterministic views.
Well, first of all, that's not true. The fact of the matter is that religions only provide a kind of framework for decision-making. They don't absolutely make a decision that I've got cancer and I'm not going to have it operated on. So, in effect, you're going to use a theological reasoning to buttress whatever decision you make. The second thing, and I've seen this in my career, people in a moment when they have to decide whether or not they're going to have a serious operation, it's not just them that'll make the decision. It's kids standing by the bedside. It's a wife or a significant other standing there who says, no, I don't want you to do this, or yes, I want you to do this. So it's not just a matter of religion. It is also social pressures from a number of different areas that impact on these decisions. So when you finally decide what you're going to do, is it free? You know, your spouse has said, you must do this. Is that free? No. Thank you very much.
Earle, if I could just add one more thing. It seems to me that free will has to do with us and whether we can change things in the world. But our subconscious is also us. You know, these things showing that we kind of made a decision in our subconscious first do not negate the idea that we are able to have action in the world because our subconscious is a part of us, right? So why isn't there that sort of holistic view that it's still us? It's just not the conscious us.
Yeah, I think it's probably because neuroscience is the new fad. You know, it's the new hula hoop on the block. I don't think we can plumb the depths of our subconscious that easily. And even though the Ouija board and all of that stuff, I think this kind of thing is just kind of scientific Ouija board, actually. So my point being then that we have no way yet of really determining what that subconscious impact is. And you know, we have dreams, right? And would you stand here now and say, I'm here because of a dream? No, because culturally it's not accepted. But in some societies,
but it still might be
accepted.
True. Yeah, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I just think that it kind of makes sense, just as maybe there are multiple dimensions and we only experience one, that, you know, there are all sorts of parts of us, and the conscious part of us is just one part. So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much.